Hey folks, Dennis here with Las Vegas Worm Farm Living Soul Community, and it's our worm topic of the week. This week, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be talking about when do you use worm castings. So most people think that worm castings are a one-time thing, but that's why their soil is probably not the best. Keeps crashing, plants keep dying, and halfway through the season, you're just like, oh my god, I want to give up. Worm castings are more than that. There's a lot of life and things that are in worm castings that keep your plants alive. So the reason a lot of these, sometimes your soil crashes is anytime you stop watering, you have temperature swings, anything happens in the soil like that, right? It affects all the biology in the soil. And we'll get to that here in a second, but it affects all the biology in the soil. So when that happens and your plants start exhibiting, signs of stress or this, that, and the other, that's when you want to reach for your worm castings. Uh, the reason that this happens is because people treat worm castings like it's a one-time product. Like you put it in once and it's supposed to be an instant fix. And living soil needs consistency. It's not just a one-time thing, right? So when you're using worm castings, sometimes you have to use them over and over again. Like I said, in these instances, like a lot of people use the worm castings and they put them in their soil mix, right? Which is perfect. You can do that. You put it into your seed mix. That's really good too, right? To give your plants a little jump start. Or the way I like to use them is I just put them in the bottom of the planting hole when I'm transplanting, right? Those are the ways that people usually get started with worm castings. That's what they're doing. They're adding this and they're like, it's going to be good for the soil, right? I know it's going to help my plants grow. So we're going to get it into the soil. We're going to get it started. And that's where it starts. But it shouldn't stop there. Again, you should be using worm castings on a semi-regular basis, especially if things are happening in your soil. If it gets really hot, if it gets really cold, if these temperature swings happen, then microbes start to die in the soil, right? And this is where you need to bring in worm castings again. If you forget to water your soil and it starts to get really dry, especially those things that are like in the fabric pots, right? They have a tendency to dry out a little bit. Or if you're growing in like indoors, potted plants and stuff like that, uh, sometimes those things can dry out or we forget to water them. My wife tends to do this with the indoor plants. If that happens, a lot of the biology that's in that soil is gone. It dies. When that happens, you can add water back into it, but the problem is you're missing out on some of those other things that you need, which are those microbes. That's when you have to add worm castings again into that system. So adding them on a regular basis is a good thing to make sure that the life is cycling. Again, we talk about worm castings, it's not fertilizer, and there's a reason behind that. We're adding life back into the soil. Another thing is that okay, one thing we do talk about in the community all the time, right, is there's four principles to a living soil, which is air, water, food, and microbes. So when we're creating these soils and these systems, sometimes our plants start exhibiting, leaf curl, or they start changing colors, or they start, things are happening that we can visually see with our plants. When that starts happening, there's something occurring in the soil. We don't know what that is. Sometimes we guess. A lot of the times we guess. Sometimes we're right. A lot of the times we're not, right? Leaf wilt, one of those things. That's pretty easy to identify as probably your plant is being stressed by not getting enough water, right? But if your leaves start changing colors, that could be a number of different things. And the only way we really know what's actually happening is when we get a soil test. Excuse me, not a soil test, a plant tissue test or a sap test or something like that to tell us what the deficiency in the plant actually is. So when these things start happening, the reason they happen is because your plant's not getting the the nutrients that it needs. Why do we get sick? Because we're not as healthy as we can be and we're susceptible to something. When that happens, what do? We either eradicate everything by taking medications or we put healthy things back into our body, right? Broths, soups, um, oranges, citrus, food, healthy things, right? Not good things for our body, so that our body can fight these things off. Same thing goes for the soil. When your plant starts exhibiting these signs of stress, whether it's, you know, in the leaves or in the soil or pests start showing up, right? It's because something's lacking. And that usually comes from the soil, which means that we need to get that biological life back into the soil, which is when we use our worm castings. A good way for us, or a good way that I like to use it, once the plant's already established, is to create an extract. We create an extract using our worm castings, and that way we can get those microbes down into the root zone where they can do all the work for the plant, turning organic material into nutrients that your plant can actually uptake, right? So they can be happy, healthy, and protect itself from pests and disease and anything else that could be that your plant could be struggling with. Transplant shop. It helps it with that, right? One of the big um, myths or misconceptions that are out there are that worm castings are only useful at one time. In reality, they're useful anytime, and they're extremely useful when they're as close as possible to the plant's roots. Now, earlier you had me say that it's good to add them into your soil mixes and your seed mixes, but here's the thing: microbes, they do a good job of breaking down organic material. They do a really good job in the root zone, where the plant root, where the plant and the root of the plant is actually feeding those microbes. Crazy thought, right? That the plant actually feeds the microbes in the soil. It actually does. So the big myth is that you only use this one time and it's only good to do. But in all actuality, you should be using worm castings all the time. Anytime you're planting, anytime you're transplanting, anytime there's a sign of anything, get some of that biology in there. You're basically adding a multivitamin to the soil to make sure that your plant has everything that it needs to get healthy again. This is extremely important. I also talked about disease resistance, and the reason it helps with disease and pests and stuff like that is, well, let's talk about disease. It helps with disease because there's more good guys than bad guys, right? In worm castings, there's a lot of good guys, not so many bad guys. When we talk about good and bad guys, we're talking about the microbes in the soil, right? There's a lot of good guys, and those good guys outcompete the bad guys. It's like us in civilization, right, or in society. There's a lot of us normal people who are really good, right, and things like that, and then there's a lot of bad people. Excuse me. There's some bad people, a little bit, right, and they're usually housed in the jail. And the jail is really small compared to the rest of the city or the size of the community that's there, right? So you got a little bit of bad people, but here's the thing: as long as we have cops around, it keeps the bad people from expanding or things going turning into the wild wild west where the bad guys take over the entire town. This is what worm castings do. They're kind of like they're good guys, but they're also good guys with kind of like good guys that are cops, right? They're coming into the soul and they're like getting rid of all the bad guys, the disease that's there that could possibly potentially harm your plant. The other things that the worm castings do when I talked about pest resistance is that the healthier your plant is, the more pest resistant it is, and that comes from Dr. Dykstra. So the more microbes you have in the soil, the more nutrients they're releasing to the plant, the healthier your plant can actually be. If it's healthy and it's strong, the pests don't want to eat it because it's not as good for them. They don't like it. So they're going to move on to a plant that's not healthy. So that's kind of how all that system works. One kicker: anytime you throw chemicals onto your soil, whether that's a pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, uh, whatever aside that you want to put on there, you kill all of the good guys. That's another time that you should be using worm castings. Anytime you kill everything, you wipe everything out, then you need to bring the good guys back in, right? If you ever go to the doctor and that we take these medications that knock out everything in our body, they always tell us that we got to get because it killed everything, we got to get everything back into balance. So like take all your probiotics and everything else to get everything back in balance and healthy again, right? Same thing goes for the soil system. So those are the times when you would want to use those. Applying can be done whenever. It really doesn't matter. The key here is that you get it into the soil when the plant starts growing. That's super important so that those microbes, that those worm castings can start doing what they do with the plant immediately as it's growing, right? It's kind of like our kids, right? We want to give them all the good things when they're really young and they're starting to grow up, right? So they grow big, strong, healthy, have good bones, brain function, all of that stuff. And then when they become teenagers or later on adults, they kind of do whatever, right? But we've given them everything from the jump start. And that's what we do with worm castings. We give them everything from the jump start. The second thing, or the other time that I would like to, or application, when it comes to application, what I like to do is seasonally. Anytime that I'm switching from seasons, I like to use my worm castings to make sure that I'm prepping my plants for that change in season, right? Well, as us as humans, right, when we go into different seasons, we also adjust and we also change. In wintertime, I grab a jacket because it's cold, right? And then in the summertime, I get rid of my jacket and I get a short sleeve shirt, right? Short sleeve shirt because it's hot. The same thing goes for the soil. We gotta now I can't find my arm. Now we gotta prep for the season. We gotta make sure everything's there so the plant has everything that it needs when those seasons change. For us here in Vegas, it's extremely important in the summertime, right? Not so much when we're going into fall or winter because we have pretty mild winters. But if you're in a different climate, right, and you're going into some pretty harsh winter seasons, and you want to make sure that your soil stays alive, then you want to do that. If you're bringing your plants indoors, right, that's a shock to the system temperature change. You want to do that. You just want to do it seasonally, just to make sure everything's there, right? It's just giving it some of that multivitamin to make sure that it can get through. During the season, sure, I do apply worm castings during the season, but it's only when I see issues, when I see problems in my soil. That's when I will actually go with some worm castings, right? Um, Again, I try to do this preemptively at the beginning of the season or the changing of the seasons, but Mother Nature has her own way of doing things, and sometimes I end up with situations where I have to go with the flow, and at that point, I will go through my worm castings, especially if the plant's exhibiting anything. If the plant's starting through the growing season, or if it's going through the growing season, right, then additional applications can be done, especially if you're transitioning from a different type of growing system. Let's say, you're like, oh, I went from using traditional growing and now I'm going to try to grow organic. Then additional applications during the growing season is going to benefit because we might be overcoming some of those traditional things, traditional methods. Specifically, what we're talking about here is we're using chemicals and fertilizers and stuff like that, right? Then we have to kind of overcome that. So we want to do additional applications to make sure that the plant has access to everything that it is. Because sometimes we have those residual chemicals in the soil and they will kill the biology. We don't see this unless you have a microscope and you look underneath the microscope to see what biology is actually there and what's not. So sometimes during the growing season, we want to apply additional things, especially if we're transitioning from one type of growing system to another. When it comes to annuals and perennials, I treat them the exact same. There's no difference there. Comparing indoor plants to outdoor plants, they're the exact same. I treat them when I put them into a new pot. If I'm adding organic material, right? If I'm seeing indications of problems, pests, deficiencies, right? Then I will go grab some worm castings and add it into my soil. The key here is that if you do nothing at all, stop asking how much or when should I do worm castings. Just use them the way the instructions say so, right? For my worm castings, it's no more than 10% of whatever the soil mix is in moderation. More is not better when it comes to worm castings, and we talk about that um, in another video. But we also talk about that in the community, right? Sometimes more is better, but a lot of the times more is not better, right? A little bit of McDonald's might be okay, but a lot of McDonald's is definitely not okay, right? Worm castings are kind of the same way. So hopefully this kind of shed some light on when should I be using worm castings and kind of how a little bit. Um, and there's really not a plant that can't benefit from worm castings. I've had people. There's a bunch of different mixes when we go to to the nursery, right? When we go to the store and we look at all of these soil mixes, there's everything from sunflower mix and cactus mix and perennial mixes and annual mixes, and it's like, oh my god, so much to choose from. Worm castings are all organic, they're all natural. If there's a worm in the soil, which there probably is, and there's a plant there, which there probably is somewhere, then the worm castings will benefit that plant. So I've used worm castings, and my customers have used worm castings with every type of plant, and they've seen good results, better results than not using it at all. So use your worm castings, follow those instructions that are on the bag. Every manufacturer is a little bit different on how they want you to use it, but you can use them all the time. It's not just a one time thing. Yes, I have seen instances where people use worm castings and it fixes their problem within days or within the week. Yes, that happens, but just look at it as it's not a band aid fix. We're trying to get the soil into a system where it will continue to cycle and do the thing that it needs to all the time. As long as we keep it watered and we give everything to the soil that it needs, right? Which is air, water, food, and microbes. That's what we're looking for. That's what we want to do when we're looking at worm castings and how to use them or when to use them. If you find this type of stuff useful, do me a favor, like, share, or subscribe. Um, but that's going to be it for this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll see y'all next week. And we'll see y'all next time.